Let me ask you something. Have you ever found yourself back in a place you were sure you had already moved past? Not completely back to the beginning, but close enough to recognize it, close enough to feel that familiar frustration of thinking, I thought I was further than this. Sometimes it shows up in something you decided to take seriously again, a habit, a commitment, a direction you felt ready to follow through on. And in the beginning, there's usually a sense of clarity. You feel aligned with it. You feel like it makes sense. You don't question it the same way you might have before. And for a while, it feels steady. You're showing up. You're moving in the direction you said you would. But somewhere along the way, something begins to change. It's not always obvious. It doesn't feel like a clear decision to stop. It's more subtle than that. You begin to hesitate in places where you didn't hesitate before. You start questioning things that once felt certain. Your energy toward it shifts just enough to notice if you're paying attention. And then, without fully deciding to step away, you do. And what makes that moment difficult isn't just that you stopped, it's that something about it feels familiar. I'm Karen, and this is The Rewrite, a podcast about finding the courage to pursue the life you already know you're meant to live. That sense of familiarity is usually what lingers, because after a while, it stops feeling like a one time thing. It starts to feel like something you've experienced before, even the details look different. And that's when the question starts to shift. It's no longer just about what happened this time, it becomes more deeper and a more honest question: why does this keep happening? And that question carries weight because now you're not just looking at a moment, you're recognizing something that's been repeating. Maybe it's starting something with full intention and then slowly falling out of it. Maybe it's trying to build better habits and finding yourself back in the same routines you said you were done with. And when that realization starts to settle in, most people turn inward and assume the simplest explanation. They tell themselves they need more discipline, that they need to stay consistent, that they just have to push through the moments where it gets hard. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable. It sounds like the kind of answer that should fix it. But if that were actually the reason, then deciding to do better would be enough. And most of the time it isn't, because this doesn't usually just fall apart at the beginning. It happens somewhere in the middle, at the point where continuing requires you to respond differently than what you're used to. Not necessarily with more effort, but with a different kind of consistency, a different way of showing up when things don't feel as clear as they did at the start. And that's where things begin to shift, not in a noticeable way, but in a way that's easy to overlook if you're not paying attention. You start to feel less certain, less anchored. You begin to question what you were once sure about. And instead of moving forward with the same clarity, you slow down. I've been there more times than I can count, recognizing what was happening, understanding it on some level, and still finding myself in that same place again. And even now, there are areas of my life where I'm still working through that. So this isn't coming from having everything figured out. It's coming from learning how to notice it while you're in it. Because once you begin to see it clearly, something changes. You realize that this isn't just about motivation, and it's not as simple as discipline in the way we usually think about it. What you're experiencing is a pattern, and patterns tend to come from what feels normal, not necessarily from what you want. That's why there can be a gap between what you know and how you respond. You can understand what needs the change. You can even want that change. But when the moment comes to follow through consistently, your response often aligns with what you've done before, with what feels familiar. So when you begin to move in a different direction, even if it's something you genuinely want, there's a part of you that hasn't fully caught up to that change yet. And that's where the discomfort shows up. Not because something is wrong, but because you're showing up in a way you're not used to yet. And that can feel unfamiliar in a way that's easy to misread. It can feel like doubt and resistance. It feels hard, sometimes like a chore. But a lot of the time, what you're actually experiencing is the process of behaving differently long enough for it to start becoming natural. And that process isn't immediate. It doesn't happen just because you've decided. It happens through repetition. I remember hearing Tony Robbins say years ago that repetition is the mother of all skill, and that stayed with me because real change doesn't happen in a single moment. It happens in what you continue to do, through continuing to respond differently in moments where it would be easier to go back to what you already know. And if you haven't stayed with that long enough yet, it's very easy to return to what feels more like yourself, what you're familiar with. Not because you don't want the change, but because familiarity has a stronger pull than intention. And that's how the pattern continues. It doesn't feel like a clear choice. It feels like a quiet return, a gradual shift back into something that feels easier to maintain, something that doesn't require as much awareness, something that feels more natural, even if it's not where you actually want to stay. So instead of focusing only on what you're trying to change, it becomes more helpful to notice what happens right before the change begins to shift. That moment where your thinking starts to change, where your energy begins to drop, where something that once felt clear starts to feel uncertain. There's usually something in there, a familiar thought, a hesitation that you felt before, a subtle shift that seems small but isn't. And the more aware you become of that moment, the less automatic your response becomes. You start to notice it instead of moving through it without thinking. And that awareness creates space, not an automatic shift right away, but enough space to pause, enough space to question what's happening instead of immediately reacting to it. And in that pause, you have a choice. Not always an easy one, but a real one. A choice to respond the way you've always have, or to try something different, even if it feels unfamiliar. Because that's where change actually begins. Not in the big decisions, but in those moments where you choose not to follow the same pattern. And those moments might not feel significant at first. They might even feel uncomfortable or unnatural. But over time, they begin to add up. They begin to shift what feels familiar. They begin to change what feels like your default response. And eventually, what once felt unfamiliar starts to feel more natural. What once required effort starts to feel more consistent. Not because it became easy, but because you stayed with it long enough for it to become a part of how you show up. And that's when the pattern begins to change. Not all at once, but gradually, in a way that becomes noticeable over time. So if you've been finding yourself in that place again, questioning why it keeps happening, I want you to understand that it doesn't mean you're incapable of change or that you're doing something wrong. It just means there's something that hasn't been fully interrupted yet. And the moment you begin to see that clearly, you're no longer just reacting to it. You're starting to understand it. And that understanding is what allows you to move through it differently. Before you move on from this, ask yourself, where have I seen this pattern show up in my life? And what's one thing I can begin doing repetitively that would move me in a better direction? And if you're open to it, share it in the comments because a lot of times what you're working through, someone else is too. Thank you so much for being here with me today and for taking the time to really sit with what may have come up for you while listening. If something in this stayed with you or helped you see something in a new way, I'd really like to hear what that was. And I look forward to having you join me again on the next episode. This is The Rewrite because your story isn't finished yet.